There's a lack of consistency in the way insurance companies treat victims, and even close neighbours are being charged very different excesses for flood insurance. Mariam Mashiri reports.
Dominic Witherow and Mike Lewin are neighbours. They both live in this property, which has been split into two separate homes. The whole building has been flooded in the past, but that's where the similarities end. Dominic, who moved into the property after the flooding and has never made a claim, has a flood excess of £100, whereas Mike, who is with a different insurer and has claimed for past flooding, is looking at an excess of £10,000.
It's an inordinate amount of money, isn't it? And obviously, if you are going to get even 2 inches of water in this place, you're going to spend quite a lot of money to get it straight. And it's a lot of money, this £10,000 to find.
You know, we are one building. We're in exactly the same area. We have exactly the same actual flood risk. There's no reason for us to have an automatic excess difference that's just so huge. It's crazy.
After the intervention of an insurance broker, both Mike and Dominic have now been offered a new insurance deal with the same excess of £2,500. But the National Flood Forum says the problem of neighbours being offered very different deals is still widespread.
Well, Lewis was the worst town. It was practically annihilated in the floods of the year 2000.
They believe thousands of homes at risk of flooding could be affected by similar problems.
It's epidemic proportions as far as I'm concerned. Everywhere we go to speak to communities at risk of flooding, the subject always gets round to insurance, and people tell us their stories, and neighbours living next door to neighbours having different excesses is really quite a huge issue.
But the body that represents insurers says it's normal for different people to get varying deals.
There's many different reasons why there's different prices. Even with properties which look very similar, they can have very different risk characteristics. That's the first answer to that. But it also depends on what the type of property. It depends on the contents you've got as a first step. But also it's because different insurers have different approaches to risk.
Everything in between is sealed. Absolutely.
Back in Surrey, Mike shows me the state-of-the-art flood protection both he and Dominic pay to have installed.
So you just clip it on with this, and that absolutely seals it solid.
Their property is now better protected than before, but the advice is if you are worried about the level of excess on your flood policy, contact your insurer, and in the meantime, try to protect your home as best you can. Mariam Mashiri, BBC News.
Well, for more on this, we're joined by insurance broker Neil Cook and Nick Starling, who's from the Association of British Insurers. Very good morning to both of you. Neil, you've been in the insurance industry for a good number of years, yes, and you've worked with these two individuals who've had this difference in premium and excess. You've had some progress there.
Yes, I have. There is some discrepancy. The house that they live in was originally one house owned by Mr. Lewin. His property was flooded twice. I'm not sure if Dominic's insurers are actually aware, or the insurers he had were aware the property has been flooded, which is why they've only given him the low excess.
So you think the discrepancy is accounted for by the lack of information
that the insurer may have picked up?
But does that still account? We still doesn't necessarily account for the fact that Mike, who was given a £10,000 excess, does that figure still stand?
It won't with me.
Well, can you be precise? I mean, what are you going to charge it?
I've got the excess down to 2,500.
Why was it ever quoted at 10,000?
That's what the previous insurer stuck at, and they haven't moved, even though he's spent, we think, around 40 or 50,000 on defending that property.
Mm. OK, so, well, Nick Starling, you're from the Association of British Insurers. Right. How can there be a situation where there is an excess of £10,000 with one insurer and £2,500 with the other, and that's the same individual, same property, same amount of information being provided?
Can I first pay tribute to our members, to the way they reacted to the floods in Cockermouth and Cumbria? They were right on the scene extremely quickly, rescuing people, putting them in alternative accommodation, putting their lives back together. I think that's the important story of this week. Insurers have different appetites for risk. And even with houses that are split in two, like the one we've seen, you can have a very different risk in each half. Just a matter of a couple of metres higher, the flood risk is much less. But our members also compete. They compete with each other, they've got a different appetite for risk, and they're not allowed to collude on pricing. They're not allowed to talk to each other about pricing. So under those circumstances, there's always going to be a different outcome for policyholders.
Well, if you've got someone who's in a property that has been flooded before, they're with an insurer, well, there's a danger, isn't there, that they would whack on that giant excess in the knowledge that, quite frankly, that person probably hasn't had many other places to go to. I mean, you don't have much choice when you're in that circumstance, do you?
It's a myth that if you've been flooded, your premium goes up and your excess goes up hugely. For the great majority of people, that doesn't happen. It certainly didn't happen after 2007 when we saw an absolutely enormous flooding. There's always going to be an issue if you're in a very high-risk area and you're talking about people who've been flooded 2 or 3 times. Remember, each time the flood costs 20, 30, 40,000 pounds. So the important thing is if you're in that sort of situation, talk to specialists like Neil, who will be able to understand the risk and talk to insurers.
So Neil, just help us with that. Is it a myth that if your property's been flooded, next time round your premium won't go up?
It could not. There is no nothing is straightforward. Each
Well, it's
person,
not going to go down.
Not very often, no.
Well,
No,
okay,
yeah.
so it can only get worse, effectively.
Okay, your premium might go up 50%, which you could bear. If it goes up to 200 to 300%, that's the start time. Don't, just because you've been given flood cover by an insurer, don't think no one else will offer it. You've got to find a specialist, though. The mainstreams won't help you. It's the specialists that will.
But Nick, isn't it the case? You know, we hear insurers have been hit with claims of £100 million after this flooding. If they're going to have to pay out lots, don't some of them think it's just logical to put up premiums and excesses? It sounds like you're not defending that. You're saying that's a myth, but it would make sense to some people that they did, wouldn't it?
Well, insurers are used to floods. We've always had floods. This was a particularly horrible flood, but it was very local, and the cost compared with, say, 2007 was quite low. If you have, say, a no claims discount, obviously your premium is going to go up. But the interesting thing is over the last 10 years, household premiums have stayed more or less the same in cash terms. They've hardly gone up at all. The average buildings and contents premium is £350. The great majority of people can get insurance at that sort of price.
Can I ask one other thing? Is it true that if you're refused insurance, someone who's been in a flood area, refused insurance by one company, that goes into a system, and thereby you might find that going against you if you try and get insurance somewhere else?
I've heard rumours, but what's the ABI opinion of this? Because
is that true?
I've never heard of that. I mean, I've gone on to comparison websites, and you can get quotes from some companies and not from others.
When you say you've heard rumours,
it's okay. In truth, you should tell your insurer, the new insurer you're approaching, that not so much you're being refused. Refused means they just don't want to do it for some other reason. But you've got to try and disclose the fact that you've been flooded and wait for the answer, And this is where people with flood issues need to go to specialists. It won't help them. They will just chase themselves around trying to get direct quotes, and it won't work. They will just run rings around themselves and get nowhere.
very interesting territory. Thank you both
That's
for
okay.
coming and taking us through it.
Thank you. Just approaching 9.